It was August 12th, 2025. A climber named Zenebech Bekele was descending from the summit of K2, the world's second highest mountain. She had just achieved a lifelong dream, standing atop the savage mountain, and the photos on her camera were incredible. She was exhausted, but glowing with pride. There was just one problem. She was about to enter what professional climbers call the death lottery. In the next few minutes, Zenebech would find out why anyone who truly understood what really happened on K2 that season would never set foot on that mountain again. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end. And if this mystery moves you, so share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. Imagine you spent 2 years of your life preparing for this one moment. You mortgaged your house, you quit your stable job, and you trained until your body screamed for mercy. You arrive at K2 Base Camp in June, expecting to see that familiar, iconic sight of snow-covered slopes stretching up toward the clouds. Instead, you're staring at what looks like a completely different planet. The mountain is brown where it should be white. Bare rock stretches up roots that should be buried under tons of protective snow. Everywhere you look, you can see loose stones just waiting to break free and tumble down without a second of warning. The Sherpa guides, men who have been climbing K2 for 30 years, were walking around base camp with expressions no one had ever seen before. It wasn't just the usual pre-climb tension. It was actual fear. Early reports coming back from the scouts were chilling. One report noted that conditions below Camp 1 were horrific, with no snow at the camp at all. When people who have spent their entire lives on the world's most dangerous mountains tell you they've never seen anything this bad, you know you aren't dealing with normal climbing conditions anymore. What happened was a freak of nature. The Karakoram Range was experiencing its worst drought in decades. The spring of 2025 had brought almost zero snowfall, followed by record-breaking temperatures. It hit 115 degrees in areas that should have been cool mountain zones. This combination was devastating. Without the usual spring snow to create a protective layer, and with extreme heat melting what little ice remained, the entire lower section of K2 was stripped bare. All that loose rock and debris that is normally held in place by compacted snow was now completely exposed and unstable. K2 had transformed into a massive rockfall zone where stones the size of bowling balls were constantly tumbling down the slopes. Every step was like playing Russian roulette with gravity. Zenebech Bekele watched the mountain from her tent. She adjusted the strap of her watch, her fingers tracing the scars on her knuckles from years of training. She had come from a small village, a woman who had fought for every inch of her success, and she wasn't ready to let a little brown rock stop her. She saw a group of climbers arguing near the mess tent. Their voices were low, jagged with nerves. One man kept kicking at the dry dirt, his eyes fixed on the summit. People were talking about the death lottery in hushed tones, but the desire to stand on top of the world is a powerful drug. It blinds you to the obvious. The veteran guides knew. They stood in small circles, speaking in their own language, occasionally glancing up at the shooting gallery above. They saw the mountain for what it was, a crumbling heap of geological trash that was ready to slide. But the money was already spent. The permits were signed. The logistics were in place. To go home now would mean financial ruin for many. So they waited. They sat in the heat, watching the dust plumes rise from falling rocks, hoping the mountain would somehow settle. But mountains don't negotiate. Zenebech spent her afternoons checking her gear for the 100th time. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, checking the seals on her oxygen tanks and the sharpness of her crampons. She could smell the dry, metallic scent of the exposed rock carried on the wind. It didn't smell like a mountain. It smelled like a quarry. Occasionally, a loud crack would echo through the valley, the sound of a boulder breaking free. Everyone would stop and look up, their hearts skipping a beat, before returning to their tasks. It was a slow, agonizing psychological grind. The injustice of it all started to seep in. The big expedition companies knew the risks were unprecedented, yet they kept taking the checks. They kept the clients in the dark about just how unstable the routes had become. They called it a challenging season when they should have called it a suicide mission. Zenebech felt the tension in her shoulders. She was an underdog here, a self-funded climber surrounded by corporate machines. She didn't have the luxury of a private weather team or a dedicated rescue helicopter. She only had her skill and her will. By mid-June, the atmosphere at base camp had curdled. The heat was relentless, and the lack of snow meant the usual water sources were drying up. Climbers were becoming irritable, their movements jerky and impatient. They were tired of the waiting, tired of the dust, and tired of the fear. But the promise of glory was still there, hanging above them like a golden prize. They convinced themselves that they would be the lucky ones. They would be the ones who didn't draw the losing number in the lottery. Zenebech noticed the way the sunlight hit the bare rock in the afternoons, making the mountain look like a jagged, rusted blade. She saw a young porter struggling with a heavy load, his face coated in fine gray dust. He looked exhausted, his eyes wide and vacant. She handed him a bottle of water, her hand brushing his as he took it. He nodded thanks but didn't speak. There was no breath to spare for words. The mountain was already taking its toll before they even started the real climb. The scouts continued to bring back bad news. The ropes couldn't be fixed securely because the rock was too brittle. The anchors were pulling out. The usual paths were gone, replaced by shifting piles of scree that moved under your feet like marbles. It was a nightmare of logistics. Yet the push for the summit continued. The corporate leaders held secret meetings, their faces grim behind expensive sunglasses. They weren't talking about safety, they were talking about weather windows and client satisfaction. Zenebech realized then that she was part of something far more disturbing than a difficult climb. She was part of a system that had lost its moral compass. She looked at her photos of Everest, the memory of her headstand at the top, giving her a brief flicker of strength. She wanted that feeling again. She wanted to prove that she belonged among the elite. But as she looked up at the brown, crumbling face of K2, she wondered if the price of that proof was more than she was willing to pay. The first act of this tragedy was already written. The mountain was ready. The people were desperate. The stage was set for a season that would strip away the mask of professional mountaineering and reveal the ugly truth beneath the ice. By the time the calendar turned to late June, the high-altitude camps on K2 had transformed from refuges into something far more sinister. Zenebech reached Camp 1 after a grueling 6-hour scramble through the loose scree, her lungs screaming for the thin, metallic air. She expected to find the usual camaraderie of the mountain, but as she crested the final ridge at 20,000 feet, she stopped dead in her tracks. The campsite sat on a precarious slope of loose rock where flat ground was as rare as a diamond in the dust. Under normal circumstances, mountaineers followed an unwritten code of respect. First come, first served. But 2025 was the year the code died. Zenebech stared at the limited flat spots, but they weren't open. They were surrounded by physical barriers of snow poles and wire, looking like tiny, high-altitude prison camps. Professional expedition companies were claiming multiple spots and defending them with wire fences, even while the spots sat empty and their owners were miles down the mountain. She saw an exhausted climber from a smaller team collapse onto a jagged rock nearby because he had no place to pitch his tent. When he tried to move a wire pole to clear a space, a guide from a major company stepped out and barked a warning. They were reserving ground for clients who hadn't even left base camp yet. This was the tent war, a militarized land grab at the edge of the world. The injustice was thick enough to choke on. At this altitude, if you can't find a flat place to rest, you could literally slide off a cliff in your sleep or die of exposure. Zenebech watched a French climber, Serge Hardy, filming the scene with a look of pure disbelief. To these corporations, it wasn't about the brotherhood of the rope anymore. It was about practical logistics and protecting the investment. It was like showing up to a parking lot and finding someone had put cones in every space and then driven away, leaving you to circle until you ran out of gas. Except here, running out of gas meant your heart stopping. But as disturbing as the fences were, the communication blackout was worse. The technical landscape was failing. Military tensions in the nearby Kashmir region meant satellite signals were being jammed or restricted. Teams would go days without a word from the outside world. Normally, when a route becomes a shooting gallery or a guide gets injured, the news travels across the mountain in hours to save lives. In 2025, that system of survival collapsed. Some the technical vacuum created a moral one. Because these expeditions cost upwards of $100,000, sharing information started to feel like giving away a competitive advantage. Zenebech heard rumors that a Sherpa from a rival team had been struck by rockfall and evacuated, but the company involved refused to report it publicly. They didn't want to alarm their high-paying clients or reveal which sections of the route had become death traps. They were hoarding weather forecasts like trade secrets, while other climbers walked blindly into storms. Inside her tent, Zenebech could hear the wind whipping against the fabric, a lonely, high-pitched whistle. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the gossip of passing porters. They spoke of the Polish climber Lucas Supergon, who was openly calling out the lack of cooperation. And the mountain was already a monster, but the humans were making it worse by refusing to speak to each other. Every person was an island. By July, the motivation was cracking. The jet stream had parked itself over the summit, making any movement impossible. Supplies were running low, people were starting to break. Zenebech saw the lead guide of Madison Mountaineering, Terry Sylvester, look at the crumbling rock and the corporate greed and make a decision that shocked the camp. He told his team, "This isn't climbing anymore. This is suicide." They packed up and walked away from their dreams. Even the world record holders were turning back, saying the mountain was too dangerous to touch. But a few remained. Zenebech was one of them. She watched the exodus of the smart teams with a heavy heart. Yeah, she felt like the underdog more than ever now, left behind by the big names, staring at a summit that seemed determined to kill anyone who dared to try. The atmosphere was desperate. The remaining teams weren't waiting for safety anymore. They were waiting for a miracle. And on August 5th, the miracle, or the curse, arrived in the form of a brief weather window. The remaining climbers made a choice that would haunt the industry forever. They decided to launch a final desperate push through the death zone in the middle of the night, hoping the freezing temperatures would hold the loose rocks in place just long enough for them to pass. It was a gamble of the highest order. Zenebech tightened her boots, her hands shaking slightly. She knew the lottery was about to begin. The mountain hadn't become safer, or the people had just become more willing to die. The gamble felt like a fever dream. Against every law of logic, on August 11th, the summit push worked. Zenebech stood on the peak of K2 at 3:32 p.m., the air so thin it felt like swallowing needles. She joined an exclusive club of fewer than 900 people in history. She was a superhero from a small village, a woman who had once performed a headstand on the summit of Everest just to feel the world spin beneath her. For a few hours, the horror of the drought and the tent wars faded into a golden triumph. But as she turned to descend, the mountain reminded her that the lottery never actually ends until your boots touch the dirt of base camp. The descent was a nightmare of gravity. Zenebech navigated the bottleneck and the Black Pyramid, the most historically deadly sections of the peak. Or by the time she reached the stretch between Camp 1 and Advanced Base Camp, she should have been in the safe zone. It was supposed to be a hiking trail compared to the vertical ice she had just survived. But the drought had turned this specific path into a shooting gallery. Without snow to glue the earth together, the rocks were alive, shifting and sliding with every gust of wind. At 12:30 p.m. on August 12th, Zenebech was walking down that familiar path, likely imagining the taste of hot tea and the feeling of a thick sleeping bag. She was hours away from safety. But high above her, a boulder the size of a bowling ball broke free. It didn't make a sound until it was too late. It struck her in the head, and in the space of a single heartbeat, the superhero of Hunan was gone. Her achievement, her struggle, and her life were erased by a piece of geological trash. Then, the real darkness set in. After her death, her expedition company, Imagine Nepal, went completely silent. They didn't post a tribute or mention the tragedy on social media. Journalists reached out, but the emails went unanswered. It was an active cover-up. While her body lay on the slopes, the companies were already spinning a narrative of triumph, promoting their successful summits as proof of human determination. They prioritized their reputations over the human being they had left behind. The 2025 season exposed the ugly underbelly of an industry that had become a factory for ego. The deaths of Zenebech and others weren't just mountain accidents. They were the result of human failures, the hoarding of safety data, the lack of cooperation, and the refusal to turn back when the risks became insane. But there were heroes too. People like Terry Sylvester, who chose his clients' lives over a photo at the top. They chose integrity over glory, and in doing so, they provided the only real hope for the future of the sport. Since the season ended, the calls for reform have been deafening. There are demands for mandatory information sharing and stricter oversight of companies that treat lives like line items on a budget. Because the summit will always be there, but the people won't be, unless we stop playing the lottery with their souls. Some stories are written in snow, but the lesson of K2 in 2025 is written in the silence of those who didn't come home. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories that challenge the way you look at the world, subscribe and join our community. Stay bold and live brave. If this deep dive into the high-stakes world of K2 moved you or made you question the cost of glory, don't let the conversation end here. Consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing to join us for more true stories of survival, resilience, and the extraordinary limits of the human spirit. Your support helps us continue to uncover the lessons written in the ice and the legacy of those who didn't make it home. Disclaimer: the following program is for entertainment and educational purposes only. While based on the documented events and fatalities of the 2025 K2 season, including the unprecedented environmental conditions and industry challenges, certain narrative elements and character perspectives have been dramatized for storytelling impact. Mountaineering is an inherently dangerous activity, and the views expressed regarding expedition management and safety protocols are intended to provoke discussion rather than serve as professional climbing advice. Always consult with certified mountain guides and safety experts before attempting high-altitude expeditions.